In case you had any questions. All right, so the world seems upside down. By the way, there are two handouts back there. So one is going to give you sort of the syllabus. It's very tentative. It may take more than 1 week for some of these. And then you've got a handout with some fill in the blank and some places to take notes. So as we think about how divided we are as a country and really just the entire Western world, and how upside down things seem to be, what are some of the issues that come to mind that highlight that division and just how crazy the world is? What are some of the general issues that come to mind?
Religion.
Okay. What else?
Absence of Christ.
Yeah. Okay. What else? Say again.
Racial tension.
Racial tension.
The
Yeah.
LGBTQ.
Yep. LGBTQ plus on and on and on. Ad nauseum there. Yeah.
Politics.
Politics. Yep. What else?
There's a financial circulation.
Yep. Finances, economics. You know, I kind of went through and thought about this today, and this is kind of the list I came up with. You know, gender, and it's this divide between fixed biology versus this fluid gender spectrum stuff that's based not on biology but on your belief. Marriage, we're divided on marriage between those who think that it's between a man and a woman, and it has a view toward the protection and flourishing of women and children, versus same-sex marriage, which can be between any two loving adults with a view toward parenting that's gender neutral. That basically mothers and fathers are interchangeable. You don't need a mother and a father. You can have two mothers or two fathers, and that can be just as good. National sovereignty is an issue. And it's the divide between countries have a right and a duty to enforce their borders and their immigration law, and that when immigrants do come, they should assimilate into their new country, versus this anti-nationalist, globalist view that basically there are no borders and that immigrants should be considered the same as citizens. Two completely different perspectives. Somebody mentioned race. There's a side that says, yes, racism is evil. It's a personal evil that views others as lesser than you, or that unfairly discriminates against people, and that people should be judged based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. They should be based on their achievement, their merit, not based on the color of their skin. And that is versus this idea that racism isn't personal, it's systemic. And it's perpetuated mainly by white Europeans on the world, that's the reason it exists. And everything that comes from that background, from that white Eurocentric background, should be deconstructed and replaced. This is critical race theory. That's what it holds. The idea of that intersectionality says that racism isn't necessarily about sin, it's just about power and power structures. Then you've got the issue of the environment, was one that came to my mind. Right? And so there's one perspective that says that people should be good stewards of the earth, and we should use the earth for human flourishing in a way that preserves it for future generations. But then there's another perspective that says that people are basically a virus that's infected the planet, and we're wrecking it by our very presence and daily lives, and that really we should elevate the environment above any concerns of human flourishing. And then when it comes to finances or economics, there's the view that of a capitalist free market that emphasizes individual rights and responsibilities, that's focused on providing goods and services that people want, and that you're responsible to work and earn and save your money and spend it the way you want. There's that perspective. And then there's the Marxist socialist perspective, whereby government controls the means of production and the flow of money and tells people whether they can work or not, where they can work, what they can and can't buy. Two different perspectives. And we could go on. We could talk about education. We could talk about news and journalism, the function of science and how it relates to faith, religious liberty, abortion, the Second Amendment. We could go on and on and on. crime, law enforcement, war. I mean, so many issues, and it just seems more and more these days that those issues become polarized. And there's one view on this side and one view on this side. But the thing is these are not simple issues, are they? Some of these are very complex issues with lots of moving parts. And sometimes you can have a more nuanced perspective on these things, but there are forces in our world that are pushing us to choose one side or another. There's the right way to think about this issue and the wrong way to think about this issue, and there's nothing in between. And then you're either on this side or you're on this side, and that's it. There's no room for middle ground. There are no gray areas. That's where we are as a society right now. And the reason I think that we are there, I think the reason why we are so divided, so upside down, people just kind of dig in their heels on their side of the issue is because we are in a war of worldviews. That's what this comes down to. It's not about politics anymore. Now, it used to be you could have your political disagreements about taxes or about, different roles of government in this sphere or that sphere. But by and large, whether you were Republican or Democrat, you shared a similar worldview. You used the same vocabulary. You meant the same thing by the words that you used. You could disagree on different policies and different ways of solving the problem, but at least you agreed on the problem. That's not true anymore. And now the reason why we seem so far away from each other is because we really are using different set of vocabulary. And we're really talking about different worldviews. And I think this war of the worldviews that we're experiencing right now is worse than any that anybody in this room has ever seen in their lifetime. It truly is a cultural shift that is happening. So that's what this study is going to be about, and that's what it's going to equip us to be able to think through these things, understand what is going on, and be equipped to speak to it. So tonight's session is, this was working a minute ago. Really? I stood over here and I tested this during dinner. Unbelievable.
It lulls you into a false
It
sense of
really did. That
security.
is so frustrating. Hold on, y'all. Okay. What is a worldview, and do I have one? Is tonight's session. Oh, there we go. Now it's working. Okay, so the first question is, what is a worldview? And a couple of ways we can think about worldviews, a couple of word pictures. A worldview is basically what it says. It's a view of the world. It's your window to the world. It's as if you're standing in a window, you're looking out at the world. What do you see? How do you see the world around you? Or you could think of it as the glasses through which we see. If I didn't have my contacts in right now, I wouldn't be able to see any of your faces. You'd be a blurry, blobby mess right now. So we wear glasses. We have lenses that help us to see the world around us. That's what our worldview does. It's the lens through which we look at the world. Another way to think about it is a horizon. You go outside and you look at the horizon, and you're seeing the world that you can see, right? I mean, I can stand outside and I can see this way and this way. I see this horizon, I see the sky, I see the ground. That's the world that I can see at that moment. But the problem is that always the world that I see? Do I always see that view and that horizon? What happens to the horizon as I'm driving down the interstate? It changes, doesn't it? It moves. If I turn around and I look this way, I might be seeing a different horizon. Well, think about this. You're standing at the beach. You're looking at that horizon. You're looking at it across the ocean. You're in a city. The horizon is going to be much closer to you, isn't it? It's going to be full of buildings. If you're out in rural America, out on a farm or a cornfield or something, you have a different kind of horizon. If you're standing on a mountain looking out from a mountaintop, you've got another different kind of horizon. So no matter, so depending on where you're standing there, the world looks very different, doesn't it? Now think about somebody's worldview that lives in a city, an urban setting, close proximity with people. You either walk everywhere you go or ride public transit everywhere you go. You don't have a yard to have to mow. You don't have a place to grow a garden. If the power goes out, you're not, out there in the middle of nowhere by yourself like you might be on that top right picture. So people who live out on a farm, somebody in the middle of Kansas, is going to have a very different worldview than somebody who has grown up and lived in the city their whole life. Someone living on an island out in the South Pacific is going to have a different worldview than somebody who grew up in the Rocky Mountains. So worldviews change. And sometimes they're dependent on where we grew up, where we live, what our life experiences are. So here are just a few definitions. So those are kind of the fun mental image, help you understand a worldview. But let's dig into some definitions, a little bit more technical here. Worldviews are the basic stuff of human existence. The lens through which the world is seen, the blueprint for how one should live in it. And above all, the sense of identity and place which enables human beings to be what they are. So some of those word pictures you just saw are here in this definition, right? It's a lens, a window through which we see the world. He uses another one there. It's a blueprint for how we should live in the world. So a worldview isn't just these high, lofty thoughts. It's also about the practical, what you do about it. And then he says it's a sense of identity and place, which, think about those different horizons. Your identity, your place in the world affects your worldview. It's part of your worldview. James Olfweis, I don't even know how to pronounce this guy's name. He wrote a book called Stained Glass, Worldviews in Social Science. He said a worldview or a vision of life, that could be another way of thinking about a worldview, it's a vision of life, is a framework or set of fundamental beliefs through which we view the world and our calling and future in it. It's a channel for ultimate beliefs which give direction and meaning to life. It's the integrative and interpretive framework by which order and disorder are judged. It is the standard by which reality is managed and pursued. It is the set of hinges on which all our everyday thinking and doing turns. What are some of the words and pictures in that definition that jump out at you? What words seem especially significant to you in that definition?
Fundamental beliefs.
Fundamental beliefs, okay? What else?
Ultimate beliefs.
Okay, ultimate beliefs. Calling. Yeah, I like that one. I like that one too. It's our calling and future in the world. Not just the way the world is now, but how am I supposed to interact with this world? What is my purpose in this world? So it talks about giving direction and meaning to life. You see words like framework, standards, hinges. Those are fundamental things. And a worldview is a fundamental, essential part of our life in the world. All right, one more definition. And this is the one, this comes from the book that is sort of my key text. I have several books and resources. I actually took a doctoral seminar on campus at New Orleans on the Christian worldview. So that's informing a lot of this, a couple of other books, but this is one that I'm using sort of as my guide for the outline. And it's by James Sires, called The Universe Next Door, a Worldview Catalog. And so this is I highly recommend it. It's very accessible. You don't have to be a PhD or something to read it. I wouldn't be able to read it if that was the case, but it's a good book. And he says a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions, assumptions, which may be true, partially true, or entirely false, that we hold consciously or subconsciously, consistently or inconsistently, about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. A little quote from the Apostle Paul there in his definition. And we're going to come back and we're going to pick this apart here later on, this definition. So let's move on to look at the biblical basis for the idea of a worldview. This isn't just a philosophical concept that people have created. And there is a lot of philosophy, a lot of people have written much about the concept of a worldview, but so does the Bible. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:5, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. He doesn't use the term. That wasn't something that they understood in the first century. That's basically what Paul is talking about, that there are arguments and pretensions that are setting themselves up against God's knowledge. What we might say, there's the right worldview, there's God's view of the world, the biblical worldview, and there's all the other worldviews. Arguments and pretensions set against the knowledge of God, and we are to take those kinds of ideas and thoughts captive to Christ. So in other words, every thought we have, every philosophy, every view of the world that we have as Christians, we are to take those captive to Christ. We're to let Jesus judge those and determine what is true and not, what is right and wrong. And we'll be doing that in our study. Peter said that in your hearts revere Christ as Lord and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And he says we're to do that with gentleness and respect. So as we come up against, and we'll talk about this later on in the session, as we come up against different worldviews, different perspectives on reality, different beliefs about the way the world is, why is it this way, how are we to interact with it, we're going to be different. We're going to be like salt. We're going to be like light in the darkness. We're going to stand out as being different. We're in the world, but not of the world. And as we come up against these different beliefs and perspectives, we need to be ready to answer those, to explain why we believe differently than they do, why we believe our worldview is the right, proper, and correct worldview. And then Paul, in Romans 12:1-2, very familiar passage, he says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And as a part of that, he says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Do not conform. Do not let your mind buy into the world's view of things. Rather, he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Again, we've got to renew our minds. We've got to think differently than the way the world thinks. And only then will we be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. But really, it really comes down to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. Genesis 1:27 tells us that God made man in his image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. We are made in the image of God, the imago Dei, which means that in many ways we were created to be like God. There are many aspects of humanity that are patterned after the very character and nature of God. Now think about this. God is a God of order, right? He's not a God of chaos. Genesis 1 is all about God bringing order out of the chaos, right? He's separating sky and sea and land, and he's creating plants and animals to reproduce after their kinds. He separates day and night and gives us the sun, moon, and stars for days and for seasons. God is bringing order to things. He's a God of order. And he created the universe to work in an orderly fashion. That's the whole reason science even exists, is the belief that the world is created in a way that makes sense, that works and functions in a rational, logical way, and that we can know this and understand it. That's based on Genesis chapter 1. That is a Christian idea. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. So God created the universe to work in a certain way, right? Laws of motion, laws of energy, gravity, physics, and time, and all of this. And God created the universe also, not just with physical laws, but with laws of logic, reason, rationale. It's a rational universe. And the reason that we, even though we can't discern the mind of God, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, his ways are deeper than our ways, but God's mind is logical. It's ordered. He's not making stuff up on the fly. He's not fickle. He's not changing, from day to day. What he said yesterday is still applicable today and tomorrow. So if that's all true of God, then is it any wonder that we also want to have well-ordered, rational thoughts? Is it any wonder that we want to categorize things and organize things and put labels on things and try to wrap our minds around things? That's the way God made us. That's part of being in his image. We see patterns and we want to fit things into systems that make sense to us. That's good. No one can live in a state of constant chaos, right? Where nothing makes sense and the rules are always changing. That's insanity. Or that drives you to insanity. That's one of the reasons why we're going insane as a country, all this COVID stuff. Every day the rules are changing. You never know who to believe and who to listen to. God made us to have a worldview. He created us, whether we realize it or not, in such a way that the people, the events of our lives, they're shaping our worldview. Our worldview is being constantly shaped by our personality, shaped by our culture, our education, the way our parents raised us and the things they taught us, life experiences, the media that we consume, the people we hang around with, all of that. Just like wind and water will erode and shape mountains, all that stuff is at work constantly on our worldview, giving it shape. So if my worldview is the beliefs that I build my life on, if it's the lens through which I see the world and interpret reality, what are some of the things my worldview might include? I'll give you an example. Good and evil. What is good? What is evil? That's part of the world. What's right and wrong? That's part of my worldview. What are some other things that might be a part of our worldview?
Your wealth, your money.
Okay. What you do with it, what it means to you. Yeah.
What goes wrong with right wrong? What is truth? What is truth? True and truth.
What is true or truth? Can you know truth? Is there truth? I mean, that's a part of your worldview. Yeah.
How you look at other people.
Yes, how you view people, humanity. What does it mean to be human? Exactly.
What your expectations are from life
Okay.
is part of your world.
Expectations of life, purpose, meaning of life, those things. Yeah. What about death and what happens after death? Is that a part of your worldview? Yeah. As is our origin. Where did we come from? How did we get here? That's part of a worldview. What else? What are some other things?
Prejudicial judgment.
Okay, definitely. Your worldview influences those things. Your view of pain and suffering. Where does pain and suffering come from? How do we handle that? Does it have a purpose? That's part of your worldview. How we think about relationships, time, money, work, play, rest, all of those things, politics, all of that. So really, all of life, isn't it? There's not an aspect of your life that is not a part of your worldview. It is all encompassing. It's the hinge upon which everything in your life swings. And this means that everybody has a worldview. Everybody has a worldview. From the most remote tribe in the Amazon jungle to the White House staff, they all have a worldview. From the most sophisticated cultural elites to the blue-collar coal mine worker in West Virginia, they all have a worldview. From the Harvard professor to the high school dropout, everyone has a lens through which they are looking at the world. And the way we look at the world makes all the difference in the world. It matters significantly. It determines how you define reality, how you relate to other people, how you think about them and relate to them. And so you and I as a Christian, we have to make sure that our worldview is a biblical worldview. That is part of our responsibility, which means that we should view life through the lens of God's inspired, infallible word, his inerrant word. This is the basis of our worldview. But sadly, few believers can really get a handle or explain exactly what that is. What is a biblical worldview? Do I have a biblical worldview? How would I explain that to someone else? Very few Christians, sadly, can do that. We can't even really always articulate the things that are influencing our worldview. How do you view the world? And where does that come from? What are the influences that have made you think about life the way you do? So that's some of the stuff we're going to explore together. As I mentioned, James Sire's book, The Universe Next Door, is one of my guiding books for this study. And I want us to pick apart his definition, kind of dissect his definition of a worldview. These are some fill in the blanks in your notes. First of all, he said it's a commitment. A worldview is a commitment. There's another book that I used in my doctoral workshop by a guy named David Nagel. It is called Worldview, the History of a Concept. If you like history and if you like philosophy type stuff, this is a great book. It's very technical. So it's not like James Sire's book. Anybody could be able to pick up James Sire's book and enjoy it. This one's a little bit, if you like kind of some technical stuff, some philosophical things, history, particularly Western history and the history of Western thought, this is a really good book. But in the book, David Nagel, who is a Christian, he says that we can conceive of the notion of a worldview in terms of the biblical doctrine of the heart as the essential faculty of human consciousness, consisting of an essential spiritual orientation and view of reality that determines one's way in the world. So in other words, he says that worldview is a matter of the heart. And when the Bible talks about your heart, it means your worldview, how you look at the world. Our worldview is something we commit to in the deepest level of our being. It's something from which the rest of life flows, or as Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. You could easily substitute worldview. Guard your worldview, because everything you do flows from it. It really does. So a worldview is a commitment. Not just something you believe up here. Secondly, he says it's a commitment that's expressed in a story or sometimes a set of assumptions. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on this idea here of worldview as a story. It's a great way of thinking about worldview. The most fundamental element of every worldview really is a story. Our worldview is about story, and narrative is our most basic way of thinking. If you think about it, we all think in terms of narrative. Right? Husbands, wives, when you get home in the evening, you ask your spouse, how was your day? You're asking for a story. Tell me what happened today, right? We think in terms, we remember in terms of story. Or what was I going to do? I was going to go over here and do this. That's a story. Story is essential. Mark Turner writes, Story is a basic principle of mind. Most of our experience, our knowledge, and our thinking are organized as stories. So if we're going to think of a worldview as a story, there are three levels to that. The first is the top level, or what some people call the meta-narrative. Maybe you've heard that phrase, meta-narrative, which means the controlling story or the big story. What is the big story of the world, of the universe? And who owns that story? Who owns the meta-narrative? Does any one culture get to say what that is and control what that big story of the world is? That's the question that different religions say, yes, we do. The Muslims say we do. The Hindus say we do. The Christians say we do. The atheists say we do. And of course, as Christians, we believe that our meta-narrative is true and all the others are false. But the biblical big story, the story of God, is the story. Now, what are the assumptions when we say that? There's some assumptions we make when we say that there is a biblical worldview, that the Christian story is the story. Huh? Everybody else is wrong. Yep. But here's an assumption that maybe you never thought about. I've never thought about this until today. There's an assumption then that all Christians share the same meta-narrative. The assumption is that all Christians share that same big story. Now, I would say that when it comes to the high points of the story, to the main beats of the story, all historically Orthodox Christians would agree. Yes, we believe the same big story, but we may express it in different ways. We may represent it with different symbols and interpret those symbols in different ways. We may emphasize a part of the story where some other Christian group might emphasize another part of the story. There might be some details in there that we disagree with. But by and large, all historically Orthodox, Bible-believing Christians, notice all of those qualifiers there, Orthodox, Bible-believing, we would say we believe the same big story. We'll talk about what that is in a little while. But then there's the middle level. So as we look at that big story, we would kind of really break it down mainly into two middle stories. There's the story of Israel, right? The Old Testament story. So God's calling of Abraham and dealing with his family, the nation of Israel, they play a middle level role in the big story. And then, of course, in the New Testament, it becomes the church. That the church then plays a middle level role in that story. But then you go down to the bottom level, and that's you and me. That's Moses, it's David, it's Samson, it's Peter and James, it's John the Baptist, it's you and it's me. All of our individual stories play up into those higher elements of the story. James Sire says, the meaning of those little stories cannot be divorced from the master story. And some of this meaning is propositional. In other words, there are some meanings to my life I get from that master story that's a proposition. God is. God created the world. I am not God. Those are propositions that come out of that story. They're things that I believe that are part of my worldview. But my story has no meaning. My life is meaningless apart from the master story, from that big story. Now, stories are powerful. History's greatest thinkers have used stories to communicate thoughts. Think about Jesus. What was one of Jesus' preferred methods of teaching? Storytelling. He told parables, right? Or we think of Aesop's fables, stories that present new ideas in subtle fashions. He was great at doing that. Stories have the power even to take what was unusual, maybe even considered taboo. Stories have the power to normalize that. Stories have the power to change our minds and perspectives on things that we thought we would never change our minds on. And when an idea is expressed enough, not argued, not proven, But when it's expressed enough through stories, through personal stories that tug on your heartstrings, it becomes embedded into your thoughts. Great example of that is the way homosexuality went from being a taboo, even illegal, to becoming the norm, to becoming celebrated. How did that happen? Was it through some great scientific discourse? Was it through somebody presenting some high rational, logical reasoning? It's through stories. It's through Hollywood. It's through music. It's through stories. The way language right now about something as basic and as commonly understood as gender is being changed by stories. That's one of the reasons why you can't even watch a commercial anymore without there being at least one same-sex couple in it, or some commercial that's talking about transgenderism. I mean, it's everywhere. That's how you change a culture. That's how you change people's worldviews. Story is a powerful thing. So if we're going to think of the story of God, or the theodrama, the drama of God, the story of God, we might think about it like a Shakespearean 5-act play. All right? So the first act, God sets the stage in creation, and we're introduced to the characters, the plot points, the setting. This is Genesis, especially the first, say, 11 chapters of Genesis, especially the first 2. But then you've got Act 2. This is where the dramatic tension enters in with sin, the fall of humanity, right? Every good story, you introduce the characters and then a problem comes up. Sin is that problem, that dynamic tension. Act 3, God turns the course of the story once more through his covenant with the people of Israel. He calls Abraham to be his family, to birth a new nation in the earth, a nation through which God will someday bless all people. Through Abraham and his family, God would someday bring this rescuer that would crush the head of the serpent. So that is the third act. Then you come to the fourth act, which is Jesus comes into the story. Here's the pivotal climax of the story is Jesus' birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection. And then the fifth act, you have the church. Carries that message of God's redemptive mission, the hope of eternal life and a new heaven and a new earth, and the church carries it around the world, making disciples of Jesus until he returns. And then I guess you could say maybe that's the sixth act, but the epilogue is that consummation of the age. So that is one way of thinking about the biblical worldview as a story. Or to put it more simply, creation, fall, redemption, glorification. Creation, God made a good earth. He made us in his image. Fall, but we turned from him. We rebelled and sin into the world, and it brought pain and suffering and evil and heartache and death. But then God worked through the people of Israel to prepare his redemption in Jesus, that he comes to save us, to rescue us from that. And then glorification, someday Christ will return and make all things new and set everything right. That is the Christian story. Now contrast that with the story of scientism. And I'll explain what scientism is. It's an atheistic view of science that really makes science a religion. We'll look at that in depth. But according to that naturalistic science, the story is different. There was a big bang that just was caused by, who knows, just some unseen natural force. And that led to the evolution of the universe, with stars and galaxies and planets, and then eventually on this little blue marble called Earth, life sprang out of the primordial soup. And over the eons, that life evolved and grew into bacteria and on into invertebrates and then into plants and animals and dinosaurs, and rocks fell from the sky and wiped out some of these things. And all of this happened over the course of billions of years until finally some ape decided he would learn how to talk and use tools and became a human being. and that we're here just for a blip on this planet, and then we're gone into nothingness. And someday that sun out there that brings us life is going to swallow us up and incinerate this planet, and eventually the whole universe will just run out of steam. That's a bit of a different story, isn't it? Bit of a downer too, isn't it? It's kind of bums me out to even say it that way. So there are some ultimate questions that every story has to answer. This is where we really dig into what the worldview is of a story. Be that the story of naturalistic science, or be that the story of the Bible. Be that your story and mine. The first question is, who am I? Who am I? We're a character in the story. Who are we? You know, sometimes when you read a play, you might look in the front. It'll give you like a list of all the characters. It'll give you a quick breakdown of who they are. Who am I? Our stories help us to know that. Then there's, where am I? What's my setting? Okay, for us, what's the answer to that? Where are we?
North America.
North America, the United States, Georgia, Thompson, the Fellowship Hall at First Baptist Church, your seat at your table, surrounded by these people. Where am I? Your setting matters, right? Where are you? Are you on a planet that was specifically created by God, or something that just randomly came about with no meaning or purpose? Where are you? If you live in the United States, you think you might have a different worldview than somebody who's living in Afghanistan right now? Setting. Then what time is it? Are we in Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, or Act 5? When are we is important. Right? Are we at the end of the story? The middle of the story? The beginning of the story? That matters, doesn't it? When you're watching a movie, it kind of matters when in the movie. You know, if you're watching TV and you're watching a show and you know you don't know how they're going to get out of this situation, and you look at the clock like, okay, they only got 3 minutes to resolve this, right? You kind of that makes a difference versus only 15 minutes in. Are we 15 minutes into the story? 30 minutes? Are the credits about to roll? That makes a difference in how we view the world. What is the problem? Now, I remember being in English class, having to do stuff like this. Identify the character, the settings, the plot. And in the plot, there's always the conflict. What is the conflict? In Star Wars, the conflict is the Empire is going to wipe out the rebels unless they do what? Blow up the Death Star, right? That's the conflict. What's the conflict? How you identify that conflict, because you can say the other way, the conflict is that, hey, these rebels are going to wipe us out unless we take care of them first. And that would be the Empire's view of it. So depending on how you identify the conflict, it kind of determines which side of it you're on. How we identify the problem in the world today. So, for example, you want to talk about critical race theory. Critical race theory proponents would say that the problem is systemic racism. That's the problem. It's this inborn, baked into the cake, systemic racism. We as Christians would say the problem is sin. It's sin. And sin manifests itself in a lot of ways, including personal racism. And yes, even institutions can promote racist thinking and racist policies, which thankfully in this country were eliminated back in the 60s. You legally cannot do any of those things today. How do you define the problem? Depends on your worldview. And then that also determines what is the solution. How do you resolve the conflict? Is the solution to go and make nice with Darth Vader and sit down and have a struggle session with him? Or is it just to blow up the Death Star? What's the conflict resolution here? In Afghanistan, What's the resolution? That's where we are today. Different people have different perspectives on what the problem there, what's the conflict there, why were we there, what's the end game? How do we get out? When do we get out? Do we get out? Your plot resolution. It's worldview. It's a part of your worldview. So that is the idea. Any questions about that? I know all of that's a big part of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're not going to get through all this tonight, by the way. We're going to finish this first session next week. I knew that was going to happen. Any thoughts or questions about this idea of worldview as a story and the different parts of that story and the questions that the story answers? Any thoughts on that?
There's a lot to digest before you sit.
It is. It really is. So we can look at worldview as a commitment. We can look at worldview as a story. The third, worldview is assumptions that may be true or not. They may be conscious or subconscious. You might not even know you have them. Consistent or inconsistent. We're not always consistent in our worldview, are we? Sometimes our worldviews make no sense because we're so inconsistent with it. Because sometimes it's because it is subconscious. We've not thought about it. We've not tried to put it into words. Here's a question I thought about as I was thinking about this point. Does God have a worldview? Does God have a worldview? Does God have an interpretive lens on the world? And I thought, no. God doesn't interpret the world. God knows the world. He doesn't have a worldview. It just is. He just knows what is. He doesn't have to think about it, interpret it, wrap his mind around it. He knows. He knows what has been, what is, and what is to come. He just sees the world as it is, the way things are. We have to have a worldview because we can't do that. We don't see what God sees. We don't know what God knows. We're often mistaken about the way things really are. Reality just is. It's not plastic. It's not something we can bend and shape to our will. And because of sin, our limits as created beings as well. So there's sin, but then there's just the fact that we're created. So we, even besides sin, we have limits in our understanding and our abilities. And so we don't always see things as they are. We don't always agree on what is true. Now we can disagree quite vehemently about what is true. So God just knows what is true, right? Our worldviews may be right, they may be wrong. Does God have a subconscious? No. God has conscience. He doesn't have a subconscious. God doesn't do things and not know that he's doing it. He doesn't feel ways and think ways, and he's not aware of it. God just has a conscience, but we have a subconscious. God is fully aware of himself at all times. We are not. We often hold beliefs and assumptions that we're not aware of. We don't even realize it. We call those blind spots. We have blind spots. And then look at that last one, consistent. Is God consistent? Yes. All the time. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He does not change. But we are inconsistent, aren't we? We can say we believe certain things and then act as if we don't. We can act as if we believe something entirely different. And we often, as I said, we adopt different worldview perspectives that are sometimes completely at odds with each other. They're contradictory, which is why one of the reasons why we can be like the shifting sand, right? This is why we can be double-minded, as the Bible says, because we can hold two opposing thoughts at the same time, which is crazy when you think about it. And then finally, Sire's definition says the worldview is the foundation on which we live. And that kind of goes back to that last point I just made, that our worldview may not be what we think it is. And one of my hopes through this study is that you would examine, what do you really believe? What really is your foundation for life? What are the underlying beliefs in your heart? Because we show the real way we live. I'm sorry, we show the real way we view our world by the way we live. It's praxis. It's what we put into practice, not just what we believe up here. I like what Vance Havner said. Look, it's up there. Vance Havner said, what I do today is what I really believe. Everything else is just religious talk. That's pretty convicting. So worldview is not just a theory, it's practical. It's how you live. All right, so we will pick back up on page, on the 8 basic worldview questions. We'll start right there next week. And as Kathy said, it's a lot to take in. Any thoughts? Any questions on what we've talked about so far? We'll dig into the rest of this next week, and if we have time, we'll start into the next segment about a biblical worldview. What is the Christian worldview? We've talked a lot about the Christian worldview. We're going to look at what the Christian worldview is using these 8 basic questions. So the 8 basic questions we'll start looking at next week is very, very important, and that will be an outline really for all the worldviews we'll look at. We'll see how each of those worldviews, week after week, answers those 8 questions. That'll give us a logical framework for being able to evaluate those different worldviews. Any thoughts or questions? One more book I want to mention, because I don't want to bring these down every week. So there's the Nagel's Worldview. There's James Sire's book, which is great. Another good one that's very easy to read. It's really thick. It's a big book. I had to read this whole book for that class. It's by Charles Colson. Okay, Chuck Colson is great, and again, lots of stories. You know, he really uses that whole stories are great ways to teach. Lots of stories, but he goes through and he uses the biblical story of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. He uses that as the main sections of the book and talks about how different worldviews see those in different ways. Different worldviews. Creation, or the beginning of things, the fall, what the problem is in the world, redemption, how do we fix what's wrong with the world, and restoration, how should we live in the world for it to be a better place. And he looks into all kinds of